I want you to picture a stark white background graph in your mind right now. Just a classic coordinate plane, you know?
Oh, yeah, like a basic X and Y axis setup.
Right, exactly. So on the left side of this graph, there's this bold, thick red line, and it is just plunging downward.
Like a total free fall.
Yeah, a complete free fall. And this line represents a country whose rank on the Global Human Development Index has been steadily eroding for decades. I mean, slipping all the way down to 157th in the world.
Which is definitely not where any country wants to be.
No, not at all. But then I want you to look at the right side of this exact same graph. Emerging from the exact same country is a bright green line, and it's skyrocketing upward.
Okay, now that is interesting.
Right. This represents their Gender Development Index. And that green line is climbing so high, so fast, that it's actually beating out some of the wealthiest, most heavily industrialized nations on the planet.
Wow. That's a massive contradiction.
It really is. And right in the middle of these two diverging lines is just a giant, glaring question mark.
Because when you stare at that divergence, it completely shatters the cognitive frameworks we usually apply to global progress.
Yeah, we are so conditioned to think about it a certain way.
We really are. We're almost like brainwashed by standard economic theory to believe that human development and gender equality they're inextricably linked to a booming economy.
Right. The traditional narrative is basically just a checklist. Like step one, a country must get rich.
Exactly. Build the factories, boost the GDP.
Yeah, modernize the grid, all that stuff. And then only at step three, as a luxury of that newly acquired wealth, the society can finally afford to build out, social fairness and gender equality.
The idea that you buy equality with surplus cash.
Exactly. But we have a stack of sources today for our deep dive that absolutely proves that checklist is a myth.
A complete myth.
We're looking at this massive, highly detailed set of global CSV data tracking socioeconomic metrics. And this goes from 1990 all the way to 2023.
It's a huge data set.
It really is.
Yeah.
And while we have the global averages, we are zooming our microscope all the way in on one specific place, the Federated States of Micronesia, or the FSM.
Because the data coming out of FSM reveals what we can only really call an equality paradox.
An equality paradox, yeah. I like that term.
It proves that a society can forge incredible, measurable pathways towards social equity, even when its economic engine is practically, stalling out.
So to really understand this paradox, we need to get our bearings in the world of 2023, for you listening. We need to figure out where Micronesia actually sits on the global map of human progress.
Right, we have to establish the baseline.
And to do that, we have to start with the HDI, the Human Development Index.
Which is arguably probably the most important metric the UN Development Program puts out.
Yeah, people hear HDI and they usually just think, oh, that's how rich a country is.
Right, but it's actually much more nuanced than that. It's a composite index. It measures average achievement across 3 fundamental dimensions of human life.
Okay, break those down for us.
So, having a long and healthy life, acquiring knowledge through education, and having a decent standard of living, which is where the income piece actually comes in.
Okay, so it's health, brains, and bank accounts.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
So let's look at the baseline. In 2023, the world average HDI reached 0.756 out of a perfect score of 1.0.
So globally, humanity is sitting at a relatively high level of development on average.
But then we pan over to the Federated States of Micronesia. In 2023, the FSM sits at 0.615.
Right, and that places them firmly in the lower bounds of what is classified as the medium human development tier.
And that score of 0.615 is what lands them at 157th globally.
Which is pretty far down the list. If you visualize a bar chart of the whole world, the global average is this tall, confident pillar. FSM is hovering significantly lower.
Struggling to break out of that middle tier.
Exactly. But the snapshot of 2023 isn't actually the most concerning part. It's the historical trajectory. It's the 20-year marathon.
The long game. Because when you look at the trend lines over the last couple of decades, the disparity between the world and Micronesia becomes glaring.
It really does. The world HDI line has this beautiful, clear, upward slope.
Yeah, back in 1990, the global average was 0.608. By 2023, it's smoothly climbed to that 0.756.
Progress is happening globally.
But the FSM's line, it is basically a flat line.
Just completely horizontal.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
In the year 2000, FSM's HDI was 0.596. At that time, they ranked 118th in the world.
And over the next 23 years, the index crawled to barely 0.615.
I mean, think about the context of those 23 years.
Right. That time frame encompasses the global technological revolution, the explosion of the internet age, the massive expansion of global supply chains.
And yet, their overall human development index moved by less than 0.02 of a point.
It's staggering when you put it like that.
I noticed a really fascinating micro trend buried in the data, too. Between 2012 and 2014, FSM's development didn't just stagnate.
Wait, it went backward.
It actually went backward. The HDI dropped from 0.605 down to 0.602. Now, I know we're talking about thousands of a point here, but in the context of global development metrics, an entire nation's HDI shrinking is a massive red flag.
Oh, absolutely. When an entire nation's HDI regresses, it usually points to a severe structural shock.
What kind of shock are we talking about?
Well, while the dataset itself doesn't offer, like a qualitative diary of events, a drop like that in an island nation often correlates with severe climate events.
Like typhoons.
Exactly. Typhoons that wipe out entire infrastructure grids or massive shifts in global commodity prices that hit remote economies disproportionately hard. It highlights the sheer fragility of their development.
So if we go back to our marathon analogy, the global economy is keeping a steady jogging pace. Everyone is generally moving forward.
Yeah, keeping a good rhythm.
But Micronesia seems to have hit the wall at mile 10, and they've just been speed-walking in place for 2 decades.
That's an incredible visual.
So I have to ask, is this just a case of a national engine running completely out of gas?
It's really tempting to look at a stagnant HDI and just assume total systemic failure, but the data demands a lot more nuance from us.
Okay, how so?
The engine isn't completely out of gas. If it were, every single metric would be plummeting simultaneously.
Right, it would be a total collapse.
Exactly. Instead, what the data shows is an engine that is leaking very specific types of fuel while perfectly conserving and even upgrading others.
That's fascinating.
So to understand why the HDI is flatlining, we have to isolate the variables. We have to look at the anchors weighing the country down.
Well, let's pull up those anchors then. Because HDI is an aggregate of health, education, and income, a low score means something specific is dragging the average down.
Right. One of those 3 pillars is crumbling.
Let's start with the health dimension, because when you look at life expectancy in FSM, the numbers are, well, they're jarring.
They really are. In 2023, the world average life expectancy at birth is 73.4 years.
People are living longer globally.
Yeah, which is a testament to better sanitation, vaccines, and just overall medical technology. But in the Federated States of Micronesia, the overall average life expectancy is only 67.2 years.
You're looking at a gap of more than 6 years right off the top.
But here's the thing, the overall average actually hides the real crisis.
How do you?
When you split that life expectancy by gender, you get this highly asymmetrical population distribution. In FSM, women live to be an average of 71.1 years old.
Okay, so that is not too far off from the global average.
Right, but the men, FSM men, have a life expectancy of just 63.5 years.
Wow. We really need to pause and process the gravity of that number for a second.
It's stark. 63.5 years for men versus 71.1 years for women. That is a 7.6-year gap between the sexes within the exact same environment.
Globally, isn't it standard for women to outlive men by maybe 3 to 4 years?
Exactly. A gap approaching 8 years is a complete statistical anomaly. This extraordinarily low life expectancy for men acts as a massive anchor.
It's single-handedly devastating the nation's HDI score in the health dimension.
Because if nearly half your population is experiencing heavy mortality in their early 60s, your national average has an artificial ceiling.
But the spreadsheet just gives us the raw numbers, right? It doesn't give us the autopsy reports.
Right.
Why is a Micronesian man born today expected to die at 63?
To understand the mechanisms behind this, we have to look at the geographic and sociocultural realities of the region.
Okay, set the scene for us.
So, FSM is not a single landmass. It is an incredibly vast archipelago spread across hundreds of small islands and atolls in the Western Pacific.
So mechanism number 1 is occupational hazard combined with extreme geographic isolation.
Yes. A significant portion of the male workforce is engaged in maritime work, deep-sea fishing, and heavy manual labor.
Which is inherently dangerous.
Highly dangerous. If a man suffers a traumatic injury on a remote atoll or experiences a sudden cardiac event, the golden hour for emergency medical care is almost impossible to meet.
That critical window to save a life.
Right. You cannot simply dispatch an ambulance. You are relying on complex maritime or air medevac logistics to reach a main island hospital.
That makes total sense. The geography itself is a mortality risk.
Yeah.
If you live on an outer island, a treatable emergency just becomes a fatal one.
Exactly. But mechanism number two is perhaps even more insidious.
What's that?
The epidemiological transition of the Pacific. Over the last few decades, we've seen a massive shift in these island nations away from traditional nutrient-dense diets.
So moving away from local fish and agriculture.
Yeah, toward a heavy reliance on imported, highly processed foods, white rice, canned meats like Spam, sugary beverages.
And that causes huge health issues.
It has triggered an absolute crisis of non-communicable diseases, specifically type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease.
And I imagine culturally, men might be less likely to go to the doctor for preventative care.
You hit the nail on the head. In many parts of the world, including FSM, men are historically much less likely to seek preventative health care than women.
So you have a population with a rising rate of chronic disease,
Living in environments where managing that disease is logistically a nightmare.
which leads directly to premature mortality. Addressing this male health crisis isn't just a medical priority for FFM. It is a statistical emergency for their overall human development.
Absolutely, because you simply cannot build a highly developed, robust society if your male workforce is dying off right as they reach peak elder knowledge or retirement age.
And that loss of human capital bleeds directly into the second anchor weighing down their HDI, the income dimension.
Right, let's look at the gross national income, or GNI, per capita.
Before we dive into the raw numbers, we need to clarify what metric we are actually using for the listeners. The data uses GNI per capita adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Which is crucial context, because a dollar buys you a very different amount of groceries in New York City than it does in a rural village in the Pacific.
Precisely. PPP is this brilliant economic tool that essentially levels the playing field. It adjusts the income figures to reflect the actual cost of living and inflation rates in different countries.
It basically asks, how much actual stuff can this income buy in this specific country?
So when we look at the world average GNI per capita in 2023, adjusted for PPP, it sits at $20,327.
Which means even with global recessions, inflation, and pandemics, the global economy generates significant, measurable wealth per person.
Now look at FSM. Their GNI per capita is sitting at just $4,246.
It's roughly a fifth of the global average.
And the historical timeline of their income is, frankly, painful to look at. Let me trace the trajectory from the data.
Go for it.
So in 1990, it was around $3,587. It took over 2 decades to hit a mini peak around 2011 and 2012, creeping up to $4,411.
Barely any movement.
Right. Then it just hovered. It had another slight bump in 2019 to $4,358. And then the pandemic era hit, and it suffered actual negative growth, sliding all the way back down to $4,246 in 2023.
You are looking at an economy that has generated essentially zero real economic growth per capita over an entire decade.
And this stagnant economic base creates a harsh, unforgiving ceiling for overall human development, right?
Oh, absolutely. You can only build the house as tall as the foundation allows. Without increasing national wealth, a country simply cannot fund the advanced infrastructure required for high development.
They can't build the tertiary hospitals to treat those chronic diseases we just talked about.
Right. They can't lay down high-speed digital connectivity for remote learning or fund universal social safety nets.
But why is it so stagnant? I mean, why can't they just pivot their economy?
Because structural island economics are incredibly unforgiving. When you have a small population scattered across millions of square miles of ocean, achieving economies of scale is virtually impossible.
Because exporting goods is astronomically expensive due to shipping logistics.
Exactly. And importing materials to build factories is equally expensive. They lack the massive land mass required for large-scale agriculture or heavy manufacturing.
So they are heavily reliant on external aid, remittances from citizens working abroad, and just a very narrow band of industries.
Which leaves them incredibly economically vulnerable.
So let's recap the narrative we have built so far. If the men in your society are dying early at 63 years old due to chronic disease and medical isolation,
Right.
and your national economy has been completely flatlined at $4,200 for a decade, you would naturally assume that the entire society is regressing across the board.
Yeah, you'd expect the schools to be failing. You'd expect social mobility to be frozen.
You'd assume gender equality is a total afterthought. But here is where the data pulls a massive, paradigm-shifting plot twist.
And this brings us to the core of the paradox we mentioned earlier. If the HDI represents FSM's economic and health struggles, the Gender Development Index, the GDI, represents their incredible, almost defiant social triumph.
Let's reveal the finding. The World Gender Development Index average in 2023 is 0.955.
Okay, keep that number in mind.
Now remember, FSM's HDI is ranked 157th in the world, near the bottom. But FSM's GDI, it is 0.953.
That is just, they are practically neck and neck with the entire global average.
It's wild. This score vaults the Federated States of Micronesia into the high GDI classification, which is Group 2 globally.
They are wildly outperforming their underlying economic constraints.
For you listening, we should break down exactly how GDI is calculated so you can really appreciate the weight of this.
Yeah, that's important because GDI doesn't measure overall wealth, it measures parity.
Right. It takes the HDI of females in a country and compares it to the HDI of males in that same country. It's a ratio.
The closer the resulting number is to 1.0, the closer the society is to absolute gender equality in basic human development achievements.
And in FSM, the female HDI is 0.598. The male HDI is 0.628. The ratio is incredibly tight.
And when you dig into the submetrics, you see exactly how they are achieving this parity. It is primarily driven by the great equalizer.
Which is education.
Exactly. Let's look at a metric called expected years of schooling. Globally, the average child entering the school system today can expect to receive about 13 years of education.
Okay. And in FSM, that overall expectation is a bit lower at 11.5 years.
But the parity within that 11.5 years is where FSM truly shines on the global stage.
The data shows that the expected years of schooling for females in FSM is 11.47 years. For males, it is 11.60 years.
That is virtually identical.
It is. This insight is profound. FSM's gender equality in expected education is actually superior to many highly developed, high-income nations.
Where we often still see significant gender skews in educational access, dropout rates, or tertiary enrollment.
So FSM has managed to cultivate a sociocultural ecosystem where, despite the lack of national wealth, the societal expectation for a girl to be educated is perfectly synchronized with a boy.
They view the intellectual capital of their daughters as being just as valuable as the intellectual capital of their sons.
Now, wait a minute. Let me play devil's advocate here because the math is starting to frustrate me a bit.
Okay.
I'm looking at this data and I'm thinking, if education is so remarkably equal and girls are sitting right next to boys for 11 and a half years of schooling,
Right.
why isn't this translating into a booming economy? If you have perfectly equal inputs into the human brain trust of your nation, shouldn't you get equal economic outputs?
You would think so.
Shouldn't this highly educated female population be starting businesses, driving the GDP upward, and shattering that $4,200 income ceiling?
That is the million-dollar question. It is the absolute crux of the FSM paradox.
So what's the answer?
We have this beautiful, statistically verifiable parity in the classroom. But to answer your question, we have to look at what happens the exact moment these perfectly equal students step out of the classroom and into the realities of the adult world.
Oh.
That is where we find the structural friction. That is where the equal foundation cracks.
Let's call up a different index to look at those cracks. The Gender Inequality Index, or GII.
Right, because while the GDI we just talked about measures achievements, the GII measures the loss in potential human development due to inequality between females and males.
It specifically looks at reproductive health, political empowerment, and the labor market.
And right away, the GII data reveals a massive bottleneck for Micronesia, the adolescent birth rate, or ABR.
Globally, the world has made significant strides in reducing gender inequality over the last 30 years. The global GII has improved from 0.52 back in 1993 down to 0.455 in 2023.
But FSM faces a very specific, incredibly stubborn friction point in the reproductive health metrics.
How are the numbers?
In 2023, FSM's adolescent birth rate is 43.7. That means there are roughly 44 births for every 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19.
Oh, wow. This is noticeably higher than the world average, which is currently sitting at 39.1.
It is.
To be fair to Micronesia, we absolutely have to point out the historical context here. 43.7 is actually a massive triumph for them compared to where they started.
That's true.
I'm looking at the data from the year 2000, and their adolescent birth rate was over 70. It was 70.3 to be exact.
So they've slashed that number significantly over the last 2 decades.
But it's still elevated above the global average. Why is this specific metric acting as such a bottleneck?
Because early childbirth acts as a massive, abrupt disruptor to that educational parity we just celebrated.
Right.
Imagine a young woman in FSM. She has been in the classroom alongside her male peers. She has the exact same intellectual capacity, the same expected years of schooling.
But if she becomes a mother at 16 or 17 years old?
The trajectory of her life alters drastically. In societies with limited economic resources, remember that $4,200 GNI, the infrastructure to support young mothers staying in school or entering the competitive workforce is often just non-existent.
There is no subsidized childcare.
Exactly. There are few flexible employment options. Early motherhood is the primary structural reason why that beautiful parity in education doesn't fully convert into lifelong economic participation. It is a massive roadblock.
And we can see the exact numerical result of that roadblock when we look at the labor force participation drop-off.
The data here paints a very clear, slightly tragic picture of what happens after school.
In FSM, the female labor force participation rate, which measures women ages 15 and older who are either working or actively looking for work, is 48.55%.
Right.
But the male labor force participation rate is 68.05%.
Now, context is vital here. 48.55% for women is actually slightly higher than the global average for women, which hovers around 47%.
So FSM women are actively participating in the global context.
Right. But the real issue, the real friction, is the internal disparity. There is a nearly 20% gap between FSM men and FSM women in the workforce.
I've heard this described in sociology as the leaky pipeline.
That is a brilliant metaphor. If we synthesize the adolescent birth rate data with this labor force drop-off, the leaky pipeline becomes incredibly visible.
The intent for equality exists in the classroom. The educational input is sound.
But traditional gender roles, the high rate of early motherhood, and a lack of modern economic infrastructure create leaks.
Women are being educated, but structural friction prevents half of that intellectual capital from fully engaging in the formal economy.
It's like having a high-performance engine in a car, but a transmission that is slipping gears. The engine is revving, the women are highly educated, but the power just doesn't make it to the wheels of the economy.
A slipping transmission. That perfectly explains why the economy is stuck at 0.615, while the gender development is at 0.953.
It really does.
But just when you think you have the society figured out, stagnant economy, health crises for men, leaky pipelines for women, the data shifts again.
Oh, this next part is wild.
We see the glass ceiling not just crack, but completely shatter. We are talking about a political revolution happening in real time.
This is undoubtedly one of the most exciting and frankly shocking statistics in the entire data set. It completely reframes how we view FSM's social evolution and their potential for future development.
Okay, if you're listening to this, I want you to truly process this number. We are looking at the percentage of seats held by women in FSM's national parliament.
Be ready for this.
From 1990 to 1995 to 2000, 2010, all the way to 2020. The number is exactly 0.0%. For 3 solid decades, there was a complete and total absence of women at the highest level of national decision-making. Zero representation.
30 years of an absolute political monopoly by men. Think about the contradiction there. In a country where women are equally educated, where they participate heavily in the labor force, they were completely locked out of the legislative process.
They could work, they could learn, but they could not govern.
Exactly.
But then, the breakthrough. Suddenly in the data for 2021, that 0.0% jumps to 7.1%.
Out of nowhere.
And then just 2 years later in 2023, it doubles again. It hits 14.3%. It's not a gradual curve. It is a massive damn rise. 30 years of pressure building up behind this wall of zero representation, and then suddenly a rupture and a surge to 14.3%.
The profound significance of this stair-step progression, I mean, it cannot be overstated.
Now, is 14.3% true parity?
No. It is still well behind the global average of 26.5% for female parliamentary representation. But in statistical analysis, the raw number matters less than the momentum. This is a historic inflection point. Remember that highly educated female demographic we discussed, the ones trapped by the leaky pipeline.
Yeah.
They have finally breached the highest political ceiling.
But I want to connect the dots here. Why does that matter for the overall HDI? Why should an economist care about this 14.3%?
Because political representation is the exact mechanism that fixes the slipping transmission. When women enter the parliament, legislative priorities inevitably shift.
Like how?
Let's look at another data point. FSM has a maternal mortality ratio of 74 deaths per 100,000 live births. In highly developed nations, that number is often in the single digits.
That's a huge difference.
When women are in power, investing in maternal health care to lower that 74 suddenly becomes a national priority. Issues like support for adolescent mothers, building childcare infrastructure, and bridging that 20% labor force gap get addressed at the policy level.
So this 14.3% isn't just a nice symbolic victory for equality.
Not at all. It is the practical tool by which FSM can begin to fix the structural frictions we diagnosed earlier. It has the potential to accelerate the solutions for both the labor force drop-off and the healthcare gaps.
It creates a feedback loop. Better political representation leads to better social policies, which plugs the leaky pipeline, which leads to better economic participation, which ultimately lifts the GNI and the HDI.
Precisely.
So we have a society making massive real-time strides in social and political equity, despite severe economic constraints. But there is a final lens we have to view this data through.
And honestly, this next part changes how we judge the very concept of global development.
Yes, the standard HDI is a highly useful tool, but it doesn't account for everything.
Right, it has blind spots.
The United Nations Development Program introduced two major adjustments to the HDI to give us a more realistic, unflinching picture of the world.
The inequality-adjusted HDI, the IHDI, and the planetary pressures-adjusted HDI, the PHDI.
Let's look at the inequality toll first, because it's sobering.
Right. The IHDI looks at how the achievements in health, education, and income are actually distributed across the population.
Because if a country has a high average income, but 90% of that wealth is held by 3 billionaires, the national average looks great on paper. But the reality for most people on the ground is poverty.
Exactly. Averages can hide a multitude of sins.
The data shows that the overall world HDI loses about 21.9% of its value when adjusted for internal inequality. The world simply isn't fair.
But FSM suffers even more here. FSM takes a hefty 25.8% loss due specifically to income inequality, alongside a 14.4% loss due to life expectancy inequality.
This illustrates what we can call development depreciation. FSM already has a very small economic pie, only 4,246 tills per capita.
Right.
But this IHDI data shows that even that incredibly small amount of wealth is distributed highly unevenly across the islands.
The uneven distribution severely exacerbates their overall stagnation. The people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder in FSM are truly struggling, which pulls the adjusted index down even further.
So on the internal inequality front, FSM takes a massive hit. The numbers don't look great. But then we introduce the PHDI, the planetary perspective.
And this metric flips the entire global script completely upside down.
This metric adjusts a nation's HDI based on its carbon dioxide emissions and its material footprint. Basically, it asks the question, how much is this country destroying the Earth in order to achieve its level of development?
This is where standard definitions of progress are put on trial.
Okay, let's hear it.
The world average for carbon dioxide emissions is around 4.5 tons per capita. High development nations, the ones at the very top of the HDI leaderboard, emit vastly more than that, often upwards of 15 or 20 tons per person.
Wow.
But FSM, their emissions are a staggering microscopic 1.297 tons per capita.
1.297 tons. They're producing almost nothing in terms of global pollution.
Barely a blip.
FSM has incredible planetary development efficiency. They're generating their 0.615 HDI and their incredibly high 0.953 GDI without choking the atmosphere with carbon.
Precisely. The global PHDI metric penalizes heavy polluters and rewards countries that achieve human development without exerting high planetary pressures.
So under this lens, FSM's relatively low consumption, low emission lifestyle transforms from being a symptom of underdevelopment into a masterclass in planetary sustainability.
They are actually pioneering something economists call the blue economy.
Let's define the blue economy for a second, because that term gets thrown around a lot. It doesn't just mean they live near the ocean, right?
Far from it. The blue economy refers to the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, improved livelihoods, and jobs while preserving the health of the ocean ecosystem.
Okay.
FSM controls a massive, exclusive economic zone, millions of square miles of ocean. Their future wealth doesn't lie in building smokestack factories. It lies in sustainable fisheries management, selling highly regulated fishing rights, and marine conservation.
Okay, I have to push back on the entire global system here because the irony is actually infuriating.
Oh, it is.
Our standard HDI metrics essentially penalize Micronesia for not having massive polluting industries, smog-filled cities, and a hyper-consumptive economy. They get a low score because they aren't destroying the planet.
Yeah.
But under the PHDI, they're practically a model citizen of the globe. Are our standard definitions of developed actually just thinly veiled definitions of highly industrialized and polluting?
I think you've hit on the ultimate paradox of global development,
Mm.
and it raises an incredibly important, urgent question about climate justice.
Because FSM is a nation of low-lying islands and atolls?
They are currently bearing the absolute brutal brunt of global planetary pressures,
Hmm.
rising sea levels, ocean acidification destroying their reefs, extreme weather events. These are existential threats to Micronesia right now, today.
Yet they are contributing the absolute least to the problem.
Their low-carbon lifestyle is ironically what keeps their traditional HDI ranking low, because they don't have the heavy industry generating the GDP that boosts the score.
It's maddening. The countries that are ranked very high on the HDI, the ones we are told to emulate, are the exact same countries whose emissions are threatening to put FSM literally underwater.
It's a really dark irony.
It completely changes how you look at that ranking of 157th. Suddenly, 157 doesn't look like a failure. It looks like a casualty of someone else's success.
It demands that we completely redefine success. If very high human development requires 15 tons of carbon per person, the planet simply cannot sustain it.
No.
FSM is proving, through hard data, that you can achieve near parity in gender education and rapidly advance political empowerment without generating a massive, toxic carbon footprint.
Which brings us to the roadmap. If we were to plot FSM on a global competitiveness quadrant for 2023, they occupy a highly unique, almost lonely position.
Yeah, they really stand out.
They are stuck in the low HCI, high GDI quadrant. They represent a society where social evolution has genuinely, measurably outpaced economic evolution.
It is a remarkable case study. Based purely on the data we've analyzed today, if we were to draft a strategic roadmap to prosperity for FSM, it would have three distinct pillars.
Okay, what's pillar one?
Number one, fix the anchor. They must aggressively address the critical health crisis facing FSM men, specifically targeting non-communicable diseases and medical isolation. A 63.5-year life expectancy is unsustainable.
It's a literal anchor.
Right. And simultaneously, they must find ways to reverse the negative GNI growth, perhaps by fully monetizing that blue economy we discussed.
Pillar number two, leverage the advantage.
Hmm.
They have already done the hardest sociocultural part. They've achieved stellar educational gender parity.
Which is huge.
Now, they must actively build the economic infrastructure to bridge that 20% gap in labor force participation. They need to build the off-ramps from early motherhood back into the economy.
And pillar number three, ride the political wave. The women of FSM cannot treat that 14.3% parliamentary representation as the finish line. It is the starting line.
They have to use it.
They must use this newly acquired political leverage to push through the exact policies that will support young mothers, protect working women, and demand better healthcare infrastructure for their remote communities.
For you listening to this, the takeaway here is profound. We started this deep dive by asking a very specific question.
Right.
Does a stagnant economy mean social fairness automatically goes out the window? The Federated States of Micronesia proves the answer is no.
Emphatically no.
It proves that a society doesn't have to wait until it is incredibly wealthy to treat its citizens fairly. Equality isn't a luxury item you buy once your GDP hits a certain magic number. It is a fundamental choice a society makes, even when resources are painfully scarce.
And that leads to a lingering thought we should all reflect on as we look at global data going forward. Micronesia is currently striving to move from a state of equal poverty toward what they hope will be equal prosperity.
Right.
But when we look at the massive planetary costs of the developed world, the carbon, the relentless consumption, the deep internal inequality, perhaps we have the entire paradigm backwards.
Well, so.
Well, instead of asking how Micronesia can develop to look more like the rest of the industrialized world, perhaps we should be asking, how can the rest of the world evolve to look a little more like Micronesia?